So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got, 30 clips on several different topics for what I think will be a really interesting show tonight. As always, this is my weekly broadcast of the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with my commentary between the clips, and along with some of those quasi-news political comedy clips I like to add to the mix. This week from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and maybe next week from Saturday Night Live's season premiere. And as always, I'll be using clips from all the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the regular Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. The several topics I'm covering this week include a couple clips on the NFL abusive player controversy, a couple clips on why we have such a student debt problem in the United States, a couple clips on the break-in at the White House over the weekend, and even a clip on the racist criminal justice system and Ferguson, Missouri. What's going on? Not much going on this week with that, but there'll be a clip on that at the end. But just like the last several weeks, the bulk of the clips will be on the escalating U.S. military action against the Islamic group ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, in Iraq and Syria, including the vote by the U.S. Congress this last week to authorize aid to the so-called moderate Syrian rebels, and also the debate over the use of U.S. ground troops in the conflict, which Bill Maher discussed with an analogy I guess you're more likely to hear from an HBO political comedy show than the Sunday morning news shows, but it's still a pretty applicable analogy, I think, that you can see over in this clip.
I'm worried about ISIS. Actually, I'm not worried about ISIS. I'm worried about America getting into another stupid war. That's what I'm worried about. Both houses of Congress now, this week, voted to ramp up the battle against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. You know, no boots on the ground, but just forward deploying advisors. We're always like the guy who tells the girl, I'm just going to put the tip in. Nothing going to happen.
And I kind of like that joke, but I think this ambiguity over ground troops was not just covered on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, but it was on all the news shows this morning in some way or another, including the report I'm going to show from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Their reporter Jonathan Karl talked about how the air war over Iraq has expanded with the inclusion of French troops, and then also talked about this ambiguity about whether the United States would be using troops on the ground or combat troops, or there's sort of a semantic ambiguity and then actual policy ambiguity, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show you that clip here.
With an assist from French pilots who are now flying their own missions over Iraq, the U.S.-led air war on ISIS has expanded. More targets, more bombs, and strikes in Syria only a matter of time. The president heads to the UN this week to make the case yet again for a global campaign to destroy ISIS. He's already made the pitch 5 times over the past 11 days, each time also making it clear what he won't do.
The American forces that have been deployed do not and will not have a combat mission in Iraq or in Syria.
The president's top generals seem to disagree.
If there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
The White House insists there is no disagreement that the president is open to having U.S. troops embedded with Iraqi troops on the front lines. Just don't call them combat troops.
These would be troops. They would be serving on the ground. These would be troops wearing boots, I assume. They would be combat ready, and they would be in the line of fire. How are you not considering these troops that are combat troops?
They are not in a combat role. They are in an advise and assist role.
Congress approved the president's plan to train rebels to fight ISIS on the ground in Syria, a rare bipartisan show of support. But wait, the Pentagon said it will take 3 to 5 months to begin the training, and that the first fighters won't be trained until the spring at the earliest. It will take about a year to train the first 5,000. That helps explain why officials say the campaign to defeat ISIS will take years and years. For this week.
So that was Jonathan Karl on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And I'm going to get to the so-called moderate Syrian rebels and what they're all about, including their leader. I'm going to show a few clips from their leader in a later report from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Their reporter, Bob Woodruff, had an interview with him. But before I get to that, I want to show a few more clips on this ambiguity about U.S. ground troops, whether they're going to be combat troops or they're going to be boots on the ground. There are all sorts of phrases that have been used, and you can see over on Fox News Sunday, of course, they highlighted the mixed messages coming from the Obama administration, asking Republican Congressman Peter King, who's a very pro-war, anti-Islam congressman. He even held hearings once on the hidden inside threat of Islam in the United States, although his anti-terrorism credentials are a little tarnished because of his support for the IRA, the Irish Republican Army in the past. But anyway, here's how Fox News emphasized this ambiguity in the Obama administration's position on boots on the ground, use of ground troops, U.S. troops in combat over in this clip.
Continuing to see this remarkable split between the president, who has doubled down this week and said absolutely no U.S. boots on the ground in a combat role, and his top military advisors, current and former civilian and military, all saying that we can't rule that out. That's a real possibility. Congressman King, your best judgment, will U.S. forces at some point have to get involved in some kind of a combat role, if only to call in airstrikes and to help Iraqi and Peshmerga forces on the front line?
Well, Chris, we already have American troops on the ground. We have special forces there. They are obviously, they're in harm's way. And I don't see how ultimately we can avoid putting combat troops on the ground in some capacity. But more than that, I don't know why the president says up front that we're not going to put boots on the ground. Don't take anything off the table. Never let the enemy know what you're going to do or not going to do. We had General Madison before the Intelligence Committee on Friday, and he was saying there's two parts to this. One, you should never let the enemy know what you're going to do. But secondly, if we are going to expect to get coalition troops out outside from that region, if the president's taken one step forward and one step sideways by saying he's not going to use combat troops, that to them shows a lack of seriousness of purpose. And that's why it's going to be harder to get the Saudis or the Jordanians or the UAE involved, because they're afraid the president is not going to stick this out. If we're not committed to it, why should they be?
Now, I think what Congressman King said there about how the U.S. has to lead using its ground troops, I think that it misses the whole point of why this shouldn't be an American-led effort. It should be a Sunni Arab-led effort, and I'll talk about that a little more maybe a little later. But I want to at least show that on Fox News Sunday they tried to give they sort of teed up that question for the Republican Peter King. They also had on Adam Schiff, of course. Fox News Sunday, they had a Republican and a Democrat on, but they both voted for the resolution in Congress, so there wasn't much of a split between them on that. But at least you can see a better answer from the Democrat Adam Schiff, talking about why it is that the president is supposed to disagree with his military advisors sometimes as to whether certain ground troops or other methods need to be used, and I'll talk about that a little more. Did you see that clip here?
Let me bring Congressman Schiff into this. You oppose the use of ground forces in a combat role in Iraq, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, the Army Chief of Staff, Ray Odierno, say that they may be needed. And so, in fact, does Robert Gates, the first Obama Secretary of Defense. Take a look.
There will be boots on the ground if there's to be any hope of success in the strategy. And I think that by continuing to repeat that, the president, in effect, traps himself.
Congressman, are Gates and Odierno and Dempsey, are they all wrong?
No, I don't think they're all wrong, but I don't think they're at odds with the president. What Dempsey has said is if circumstances down the road pose a threat to the United States, he'll make a different recommendation. That is what he should do. His role is different than the president's, but I think the
president isn't saying, well, if circumstances change. He's saying no U.S. combat forces.
Yes, that's what he's saying. But Dempsey is also saying that he subscribes to the strategy of utilizing Iraqi and Peshmerga forces on the ground, not Americans in a combat mission. I think that's the right call. What the general is saying is, I'm in agreement with that strategy. If that strategy doesn't work, or at some point there's a threat to the United States, I'm going to make a different recommendation to the president, and that's exactly what we should want.
And do you think the president will be open then to a different strategy?
I think the president will be open, but Chris, I want a president who is not going to accept everything that the military says uncritically. Look, we have tried massive occupations in Iraq earlier and in Afghanistan. We're in Afghanistan now 13 years later. We still haven't solved the problem in Afghanistan. Do we really want to be in a position where 13 years from now we are massively occupying Syria and Iraq? I don't think that's what we want. And one other point, Chris, and that is the president's role is obviously different than the military command's role. It's the military command's job to tell the president what they want. It's the president's job to decide what they need. And the president has to bring our country along, and that's a tough job.
We have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you each one more.
So, yeah, you can see that at least they did have that opinion on Fox News of someone, even though all the questions on Fox News presumed that these boots on the ground and the ground troops would be needed, and that the president should be listening to what his military advisors say on that subject. They at least had Democratic Congressman from California, Adam Schiff, talk about how the president is supposed to have civilian control over the military, so not necessarily supposed to take all of their recommendations. It's supposed to put some sort of strategy, not necessarily give them everything they want, just give them what they need. Or I don't know if that's actually accurate, but I mean, as to what is actually going to reach the goals of the Obama administration in terms of degrading and defeating ISIS, whether it will actually require U.S. troops in the future. It's possible, although there are other possible ways of handling it. But I also want to show NBC highlighted the same ambiguity in the Obama administration on the question of ground troops that I showed in the ABC News piece and also from the Fox News questions. And so here's the NBC's Chuck Todd on Meet the Press doing a rewind on various statements about ground troops from the Obama administration and from some other sources in the last couple weeks here.
Iraq and Syria. Last week, the House and Senate voted resoundingly to approve funding for the so-called moderate Syrian rebels. But there are huge questions that remain over the president's strategy after the country's most senior general, Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, suggested that American troops might be needed on the ground. It's an option that the president continues to rule out. All this adding to a sense of confusion about the administration's approach to defeat ISIS. In fact, let's rewind and watch what we've seen just over the last few days.
These American forces will not have a combat mission.
And if there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
The nation's top military officer just opened the door to the possibility of American combat troops in this fight against ISIS, despite what the president told the nation.
I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq.
There is no way in hell we're going to beat these guys without an American ground component in Iraq and Syria.
U.S. ground troops will not be sent into combat in this conflict.
So there will be boots on the ground if there's to be any hope of success in the strategy.
Our strategy does not involve U.S. troops on the ground in a combat role.
Joining me now is...
Yeah, that at the end there, that was Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and I'll have several clips from her. I think she may have done the full Ginsburg or did 4 out of 5 shows this morning, and I'll have several clips of her from a few of the shows. But I just showed NBC emphasizing this ambiguity about ground troops, and then they actually had a couple different opinions on ground troops on NBC's Meet the Press. I'm going to show the Democratic Senator Chris Murphy a little later in the program, but first I want to show the pro-ground troop, very gung-ho Republican position that they had on NBC's Meet the Press from Republican Senator Ron Johnson, saying why he thinks the ground troops will be necessary to meet the Obama administration's own goals over in this clip.
If you want to see what is going to happen in the future, you have to look to the past. And we've had testifying before our committee, and I've been talking to people behind the scenes that were involved in the 2007 surge. And back then, we were fighting 6,000 to 8,000 members of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that's basically what
what ISIS is now.
Right,
It's a form.
They're
it's
the success organization because we didn't leave a stabilizing force behind, and so they were able to rise from the ashes. But back then, we had engaged about 100,000 Sunnis in that battle. We had about 100,000 Iraq security forces that were, once we cleared, we would hold, and they provided protection for the Sunni populations. And we had 160,000 American troops. Probably 35 to 40,000 of those were involved in that fight. That's what it took for us to defeat 6,000 to 8,000 members of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now we've got 31,000 of members of the Islamic State, and we don't have a strategy for defeating them. Listen, I believe they're a threat. I agree with President Obama's goal that they must be defeated. I'm just not seeing the strategy that's actually going to work.
So you're open to the idea of keeping combat troops on the table, it sounds like.
I'm
the way
open,
you're talking about
I'm no military expert. Yeah, I'm certainly open to doing what it takes to achieve the goal that President Obama has stated. We have to defeat ISIS because they've made their intentions very clear. We know what their aims are. They need to be defeated.
Senator Murphy.
So that's a strong voice from the Republican Party in favor of using U.S. ground troops to reach the goal that the Obama administration has set, although, as I showed in those ambiguous positions in the Obama administration clips, President Obama has specifically said there aren't going to be U.S. ground troops in a combat role. And then one of the things I notice is that the people who are advocating for the use of U.S. ground troops in a combat role or something like that, or who are strongest in favor of military action, are also talking about the ISIS atrocities or the Islamic State atrocities and really playing that up. And I don't know if what they're saying is inaccurate, but I've noticed every time the United States is gearing up for war, you hear atrocity stories about the enemy. And some of I remember there were, back before Desert Storm, there were these atrocity stories about Saddam Hussein's troops in Kuwait throwing babies out of incubators that turned out not to be true. But here, I think some of these ISIS atrocity stories are actually more likely to be true because they are kind of a nasty bunch of people. And you can hear Ron Johnson sorry to have to explain some of the details of the atrocities of ISIS over in this clip.
Chuck, it has to be pointed out, you cannot negotiate with ISIS. Their diplomacy consists of beheadings, crucifixions. We've heard of, obviously mass executions. And what they do to women is just, we sanitize it. We say they enslave women. No, the fighters that took over Mosul Dam, and I hate to say this, but people have to face this. There were 2 women bound. They were naked. They'd been raped repeatedly. They were the spoils of war. That's who we're fighting right now, and we've been at war with this Islamic terror since 1993. We have to recognize it. We can't bury our head in the sands on this.
Well, so that's a Republican Senator, Ron Johnson, talking about the awful atrocities of ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call them. And having shown that, I also want to show my Democratic senator, to the extent she really is a Democrat, Dianne Feinstein from California, who is also, she's the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee and has been a real apologist for NSA spying and also for a lot of counterterrorism actions that I think are a little bit too militaristic. And you can see that she is also part of this hyping of the threat from ISIS. Not, again, they are a nasty bunch of people, and so I'm not even saying that these atrocity stories aren't true, but you'll see she was over on CBS's Face the Nation with Bob Schieffer, and he asks about this new group called Khorasan, which I only know a little bit about. It's sort of like an offshoot of Al-Qaeda that's now in Syria and trying to work with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula over in Yemen, and it's all kind of a complicated Al-Qaeda offshoot. I mean, I never had heard of Khorasan until today, other than I think it's like the galactic capital in Star Wars or something. But you can see Bob Schieffer asks Senator Dianne Feinstein about this new threat from Khorasan, and she says there are 3 threats, and it turns out the first and the third one are both ISIS, and then she gets into some ISIS atrocities. She doesn't remember all 3 of her things, which I guess happens to people, but anyway, here's that clip from CBS's Face the Nation this morning here.
You share Chairman Rogers' concern about this group?
I do. And I think there are essentially three major groups that would affect our national security, affect our homeland. Of course, one of them is ISIL. Another is AQAP coming out of Yemen that has a bomb that goes through magnetometers, has tried to get 4 of those on different occasions into our country. And there is ISIL. Each one of these is capable one day, some sooner than later, of a strike against our country. So this is not a good situation. With ISIL, in my view, at least, it's a little more complicated. This aims to be a country, a caliphate. It has a third of Syria already. It's occupied some 14, 15 cities in Iraq. It beheads excuse me, it beheads children. I have a picture of what I estimate to be a 6-year-old girl in a gingham party dress, white tights, a little red band around her wrist, Mary Jane's, and she's lying on the ground and her head is gone. This could be an American child, it could be a European child, it could be a child anywhere. And this is the mentality of the group that we are so concerned with. They have killed thousands. They are marching on. They have an army. They're well organized. Many of us believe they're aimed at Baghdad, perhaps our embassy there, and who knows what else. So the question, I think, comes, what kind of authorization of use of force we give the president. And when we go back after the election, that has to be a major point of debate.
Well, let me
And I'll get to that point of debate on the authorization from Congress in a minute, but I wanted to emphasize that part where she's a Democrat spreading the atrocity story, just like I showed the Republican, that, you know, ISIS is out there beheading little girls in gingham dresses wearing Mary Janes, and she has the picture. So and she said also that it could, you know, that girl could be anywhere in Europe or America, and I'll show there'll be another question about the possibility of a beheading spree based on an Australian plot that I'll get to in a minute. But I actually showed those CBS Face the Nation clips out of order because I wanted to do the transition based on the atrocities. But you can see first Bob Schieffer asked the Republican Mike Rogers, who is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, asked him about the Coruscant group, and that's where I got the whole thing about the Star Wars Galactic Capital, and you can see it over in this clip.
The New York Times reports today that a Syrian terror group called Khorasan is more of a direct threat to the United States and Europe than ISIS. You have talked about this, Congressman Rogers, but it's not gotten much attention, I must say. I'd like to ask both of you. All of a sudden now, ISIS is here, and all of a sudden we're hearing there's something worse down the line.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Al-Qaeda always has been on that immediate path of conducting Western attacks. We shouldn't forget it. What happened with ISIS, and I disagree with the assumption that it's less. It's different. That's more immediate. This group that you call Khorasan group, we described it before as forward deployed Al-Qaeda operatives who were engaging with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to develop a terror plot to bring down airplanes. They haven't lost that interest in doing it. That means it's serious. They have both capability, financing, and people. All of that's dangerous. But if you step back, so does ISIS, except they have something different. They have access to people with Western passports. Well, al-Nusra, this group of al-Qaeda individuals, and al-Nusra is an al-Qaeda group in Syria, we believe has access to some of those same individuals. That's why we're so concerned about the possibility of them pulling off a successful attack, and why we've re-tripled our efforts, if you will.
Senator Feinstein.
So yeah, that's the first part about the Khorasan group, which I guess is an Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria that's working with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They're Yemen bomb makers and maybe using some of these ISIS fighters with American and European passports. So it's like everybody working together to attack the United States, according to the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers. And on that topic, I also want to show clip, Chris Wallace over back on Fox News Sunday had Peter King on, who, as I said, is always an alarmist about the possibility of terrorism, and raised with him, like I said, was talking about before, this Australian beheading plot where apparently some ISIS sympathizers in Australia were going to go around randomly beheading people, and brought this up as something that we should be worried about. And then you see that Adam Schiff, who was the Democrat on there, kind of limited the threat from ISIS just by pointing to this, Khorasan, or the al-Nusra group, which is the other al-Qaeda group in Syria. And then at the very end, you'll see Peter King brings up a story that I debunked in a previous video about al-Qaeda trying to attack Fort Knox. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after I show all those that clip here.
Finally, Congressman King, and as we mentioned, you're a member of the House Homeland Security Committee. There was this extraordinary event in Australia this week where 15 people were arrested in Australia for allegedly planning public beheadings that they'd been urged to carry out on the internet. How concerned are you about the threat here to the U.S. homeland, either from ISIS or from other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria, like a new group we're hearing about, Khorasan? How concerned are you about the threat to the U.S. homeland, either from self-radicalized people who hear about these things on the internet, or foreign fighters who are in Syria or Iraq and then come back?
Chris, I am very concerned. We still have al-Qaeda. We still have al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We have this new group you mentioned, the Khorasan group, and ISIS and other al-Qaeda affiliates, plus homegrown. And I don't subscribe to this belief at all that ISIS is not a threat to the homeland, not just from fighters coming back, but they have thousands of Europeans with passports who can come into the U.S. They have more money, more fighters, and more sophistication than al-Qaeda had on 9/11. They are a real threat to the U.S. In fact, back in 2011,
real briefly, real briefly,
that we can't take our eye off the ball, because Al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra franchise in Syria, poses a more immediate threat to our homeland than ISIS does at the present. They're trying to work with AQAP bomb makers to smuggle on bombs on our planes. We cannot lose sight of that threat. That's really the more immediate threat to America.
Yeah. No, Adam, I would disagree. I would say they're all a threat. They're equal threats. They're coming at us, and we have to be on our guard at all times. If ISIS went into Australia, they can certainly come into the U.S. In 2011, they attempted to attack Fort Knox. So all of them, I say, are threats. We can't let our guard down at all.
Gentlemen, you have thoroughly scared me. Congressman King, Congressman Schiff, thank you both. Thanks.
It's interesting to see Chris Wallace there at the end admit that he's been thoroughly scared by the guests, and you heard Peter King make that claim that al-Qaeda planned to attack Fort Knox that I debunked in a video titled "Did al-Qaeda plan to attack Fort Knox?" And I debunked the claim coming from Peter King. And I've heard him make it, I think, 3 or 4 times now. I don't know why no one ever calls him on it. And I think all this, like I said, I don't think that ISIS and these other groups are nice people. I think that they're nasty people, and I think some of them are a threat to the United States to some extent or another. More the Al-Qaeda groups and al-Nusra than ISIS, which I think is more focused on taking territory in the region and is actually trying to get us to bring our troops there because they want to fight us there. And that's kind of a point I saw Bill Maher make over on HBO's Real Time last Friday, where he talked about in his new rules at the end, did an extended piece on how terrorism is actually working for the terrorists. They're getting what they want, and here's a small clip from the beginning of that right here.
New rule when it comes to being baited into going to war. America has to try a little harder to not be so fucking easy. Excuse me. Sorry. Just a few months ago, polls showed Americans were sick of war, that had enough. They were anxious to stay out of the Middle East. Then they saw 2 beheadings, and overnight, they were like, oh, war, we can't stay mad at you. Conservatives love to vilify anyone who doesn't want to immediately throw down as appeasers. But when you're dealing with terrorists whose aim is to bait us into overreaction and you oblige them, aren't you the appeaser?
And, that's a point of view I don't see expressed very often on the corporate news media. I did see Chris Hayes on All In with Chris Hayes make a similar argument this week that basically the terrorists have gotten what they wanted through the beheading videos. And so it's not totally missing in the corporate media, but I think that was a good expression of it there, so I wanted to play that clip. I also, I showed how Bob Schieffer was sort of teeing up both Mike Rogers and Dianne Feinstein on the threat from ISIS, and I actually have given Bob Schieffer kind of a hard time for being kind of pro-war. I think I've shown several clips over the last few weeks on my LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundups where Bob Schieffer has definitely been pro-war for this whole ISIS threat from Syria. But I think that sometimes Bob Schieffer says some important criticisms of our government, and in one of his little commentaries, I don't normally show his commentaries or the pundits talking, but I thought he made an important point about the way Congress voted on support for the Syrian rebels this week in a way that is not very courageous, and he compared them actually to this Roosevelt documentary, the Ken Burns documentary about FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt that's been on PBS, and here's the comparison he made to their courage, to the lack of courage we see in Washington today, especially regarding the Syrian vote here.
Around here, what set them apart, to my mind, was their courage. When they saw wrong, they not only tried to make it right, but they did so with no guarantee of success. What a glaring contrast to the Washington of today, which spends most of its time doing nothing and the rest of its time devising schemes to avoid responsibility for anything. The latest example: when Congress approved arming the Syrian rebels, they stuck the legislation in a bill that also provided money to keep the government from shutting down. That way, if arming the rebels turns out to be a debacle, members can say, I was never for arming the rebels, I just voted to prevent a government shutdown. The Roosevelt documentary was 14 hours long, spread over 7 nights. A story about the courage of today's Washington would take about 30 minutes at most.
So that's kind of snarky. That's kind of nasty, I guess, criticism of Washington, but I don't think that there are many people who would disagree with the analysis. And having shown a good thing that Bob Schieffer said, he also said kind of a weird thing when he introduced his two guests. He talked about how they were so bipartisan for appearing together, which he says that Republicans and Democrats won't do. Maybe, I don't know, maybe on his show, but I think I have shown several pairs of Democrats and Republicans appearing together, even on Face the Nation, but it happens all the time, so I don't know why Bob Schieffer introduced his guests like this.
And to talk about all of that, the two chairs of the Intelligence Committees are here with us this morning. It's rare for a Republican and a Democrat to appear together anymore in Washington, which is just another sign of the partisan divide, but two are willing to do that. California Senator Dianne Feinstein, she's in San Francisco. Michigan Congressman Mike Rogers here in the studio. They chair the two Intelligence Committees. And
So yeah, that seems kind of a weird, undeserved pat on the back for having a Republican and a Democrat on the show at the same time, which seems to happen all the time, as I show on my LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Week after week, we have Republicans and Democrats appearing together. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree. Anyway, I'm going to finish up with a couple more clips from Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation on the whole topic of ISIS and Syria and Iraq and the U.S. response. First, he was one of the ones who interviewed the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and he actually asked her a question I saw asked on multiple shows, but I'm only going to show her answer once, which is about how Secretary of State John Kerry said that Iran might have a role in this coalition to fight ISIS, which raised some eyebrows since Iran is a hated country amongst many in Congress, and that was evident in some other clips I'm not going to show, but here's how Samantha Power responded to that question about Iran from Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation this morning here.
Kerry said last week in New York that every country has a part in this, including Iran. What exactly is Iran's part?
Well, let me stress that we are not coordinating military operations or sharing intelligence with Iran. I think what the Secretary meant was that Iran has made clear that it too views ISIL as an enemy and as a threat. And so in that respect, all of our operations are oriented around the objective of degrading and destroying ISIL, and we're waiting to hear whether Iran thinks it has a constructive role to play. But I would note that Iran's behavior and its actions in Syria have been very destructive from our perspective, supporting Hezbollah, supporting the Assad regime, which itself has both been complicit with ISIL, not exhibiting any energy or intensity in going after ISIL, spending much more time going after civilian neighborhoods and the moderate opposition than going after such a profound, monstrous terrorist threat. And that they have received the full support of Iran, as you know, throughout this conflict. So that those actions would have to change, really, if we're going to deal with ISIL in a comprehensive way. Assad is not somebody who can be relied upon as a partner in the effort against ISIL.
So that was a kind of interesting answer from Samantha Power, and what you didn't say that I think is the reason that Iran isn't the best partner here is what I think the United States really needs to do to win this conflict is to put together a coalition of moderate Sunnis and moderate Shia, and Iran is kind of the source of the radical Shias in the Middle East. You know, they support not just Assad, but and Hezbollah and Hamas, and then of course there's the radical Sunnis, which get some support from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some of those Sunni countries and United Arab Emirates, not from the governments necessarily, but from individuals there. And that's ISIS, ISIL, and Al-Qaeda are the Sunni radicals. So what the United States, I think, really needs to do is create some sort of coalition between moderate Sunnis and moderate Shia against the radicals on both sides of that divide. And I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, although I did see one more clip from CBS's Face the Nation. They had on Joe Lieberman, who I don't agree on about much, and I don't even necessarily agree with this group he's forming, but it's the closest I've come to finding anyone who sort of agrees with that analysis I just gave about how you actually need to fight extremism and put together the moderates, although I don't think he explains it the way I just did, but I'll talk about that a little more after you see that clip here.
What exactly are you going to do?
Thanks, Bob. The Counter-Extremism Project will be a private, non-profit, international action and policy group, which essentially is saying the greatest threat to our security, world security, today comes from extremism, and most of it today is from Islamic extremism, terrorism, violence. Governments obviously have to lead, but we think there's a role for people in private life. And we're going to do three things mainly. One, create a database of these terrorist groups and who's supporting them, their financial support. Secondly, we're going to work to break that financial support. For instance, if you're a company illegally buying oil from ISIL or ISIS, we're going to call you out and put pressure on you to stop. And the third, really important, and we're building support from leaders in the Muslim world for this, there needs to be a well-financed counter-narrative to the extremist ideology that is drawing more and more young, disaffected Muslims into this terrible, violent lifestyle. It's very clear, everywhere the extremists go, including ISIS, the people, the Muslims on the ground, are terrified, and a lot of them are leaving. They don't want this. This is unpopular. But if the rest of the world sits back and doesn't provide a counter-narrative to this violence, they'll leave, and the extremists, with all their brutality, will dominate more and more of the world. We can't let that happen.
Bob, you...
Now, like I said, I agree with the abstract principle of needing to put together a coalition of moderates, although he wasn't talking about Sunnis and Shia necessarily, and I don't really know what it was he meant when he said about putting together a counter-narrative. I mean, that needs a lot more details before I can even decide whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. But there was sort of a counter narrative, I guess, coming from the head of the moderate Syrian opposition, the Free Syrian Army, or this guy is the I think president is his title of one of the Syrian opposition groups. He's going to talk to the UN. His name is Hadi Al-Bahra, I think is how you pronounce it. And he was part of a news segment from ABC's Bob Woodruff on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, reporting on what's going on with these moderate Syrian opposition groups over in this clip.
As the fight against ISIS in Iraq grabbed attention, what's referred to as the moderate rebels in Syria have largely been the forgotten story, until now.
We must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL.
3 years ago, in a popular revolt, the opposition rose up against dictator Bashar al-Assad. Now they're taking on the vicious terror group ISIS, too. This week, the leader of the moderates, Hadi Al-Bahra, asked the UN General Assembly to ask for assistance for a group President Obama once described as
blacksmiths and dentists. These aren't professional fighters.
This statement, makes me very proud of my people. This situation reminds me greatly with the American Revolution. Who made this revolution? Wasn't it farmers, doctors? We are the normal Syrian fighting for our freedom.
And now the U.S. is beefing up efforts to help them with funding and military training, which has led to some concerns.
And we're told that if there are more weapons that are brought into Syria from the United States, that a lot of these people could shift to different groups based on how much weaponry they have.
No, I assure you, all the aid will go into moderate national Syrian army, the Free Syrian Army, and we'll be very careful with it.
How long do you think it'll take, if you get what you want from the United States, for this peace to come, for this war to end?
If it's done correctly, it could be done within 2 to 3 years at max.
2 or 3 years?
Yes.
So are you asking the United States to put some troops on the ground?
We are not asking anyone to fight our own war.
It's not just Bahra.
Now, I don't know. That seems a little bit optimistic to me. And I mean, 2 to 3 years, and that's just to take care of ISIS. What about taking care of the actual government in Syria, Assad? And that's a question that Chuck Todd ended up asking Ambassador Samantha Power about whether these moderate Syrian rebels were going to be fighting just ISIS or whether they were also going to be fighting Bashar al-Assad, the head of the Syrian government, and you can see her response over in this clip.
Moderate opposition in Syria. I'm a little confused at who we're training them to fight. All week long, the president says we're training them to fight ISIS. But a year ago, the idea was to train the moderate Syrians to fight Assad. Are we training them to fight ISIS? Are we training them to fight Assad? Who are we training them to fight?
Well, as you know, our national security imperative is to go after ISIL and to degrade and destroy it over time. And the moderate opposition now will have greater capabilities to do that thanks to an overwhelming bipartisan vote in Congress to support that.
But is that what the Free Syrian Army wants to do? I thought the Free Syrian Army was trying to fight Assad, that they've been fighting side by side in some cases with ISIS. That's why. Do they know that's why we're training them?
They do, but may I add, the training also will service these troops in the same struggle that they've been in since the beginning of this conflict against the Assad regime. Let me note, the Free Syrian Army and other moderate forces have been fighting ISIL since December. They have pushed ISIL out of strategic areas. The reason that they've lost, the moderate opposition have lost territory over time, is that they have been fighting ISIL and taking the fight to ISIL on the one hand, and then also fighting a regime that is backed by Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, etc. So we think with an infusion of support, these fighters who have actually held their own against this wide array of actors fighting on all fronts will be in a much stronger position both to go after ISIL and to put pressure on the regime so we can get back to the negotiating table for a political solution.
So that is Samantha Power's explanation of what the Syrian rebels are going to do with this aid that Congress just voted to allow the Obama administration to give to them. And NBC actually had one of the Democrats on the program who voted no on this authorization to aid the Syrian rebels It was Senator Chris Murphy, and I think from him you'll hear what may have been sort of an early policy from the Obama administration before they decided, after the beheadings, that they had to get more robust. Well, actually, it was a little earlier than that the Obama administration started the airstrikes, because the first beheading was actually a response to the airstrikes, supposedly. But anyway, here's Senator Chris Murphy explaining why he voted no on aiding the Syrian rebels, because he's unsure about exactly who they are and what they're going to do over in this clip.
Senator Murphy, let me start with you. Why did you vote against the president's request to arm these rebels?
So I'm broadly supportive of the president's strategy. There's no doubt we need to have a strong response to ISIL. The question is whether getting involved in a very complicated sectarian civil war in Syria is necessary to the overall strategy. The reality is that over the last year, these so-called moderate rebels have been openly coordinating with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a wing of al-Qaeda. It is likely an impossibility that they can effectively fight on two fronts, against both Assad and against ISIS. And to me, the risk is that the United States begins getting involved in what may be a very long-term commitment to a messy civil war inside Syria. I think that with airstrikes in Syria, counterterrorism, and a focus on Iraq, you can effectively degrade ISIS to the point that you have the room for a political solution.
I guess, Senator...
And that part at the end where Senator Chris Murphy was talking about degrading ISIS rather than defeating ISIS is why I think that he may still be working off an early version of the Obama administration's policy, because that was one of the problems that they got into, was that they started talking about degrading ISIS instead of defeating them at the beginning. And I also want to show over on Fox News Sunday, they had on a Republican and a Democrat, but of course both of them ended up, both of the Fox News Sunday guests were politicians who voted for the resolution. And you can see even in the intro they had to show that supporting this resolution doesn't mean you necessarily support President Obama. It's, I think, what was the phrase that Chris Wallace used? Something like, you have to hold your nose to vote yes, but then they both voted yes. You can see this is his intro to the segment here.
Congress is now on record giving bipartisan approval to President Obama's plan to train Syrian rebels. But it was a hold your nose and say yes vote, as members of Congress and some of the president's top military advisors expressed strong doubts about the Obama plan to fight ISIS. We want to explore that with two members of the House Intelligence Committee, who both voted to approve the president's request. In New York...
So yeah, I guess that's kind of Fox News bipartisanship. You have a Democrat and a Republican on, but they're both pro-war, which, like I showed, at least NBC had on Senator Chris Murphy, who voted no, although not because he's not for the airstrikes or the strategy, he's just not for arming the Syrian rebels. And then I also want to show over on Fox News Sunday, they had Representative Adam Schiff on, and he talked about how Congress is actually abdicating its responsibility by not voting for, a declaration of war or an actual authorization for use of military force. You saw that at the tail end of Dianne Feinstein's comment, and it sounds like Congress may actually debate this and vote on it after the election when they come back as kind of like a lame duck Congress. But anyway, here's what Adam Schiff said on Fox News Sunday about that here.
Congress, because this week, as we pointed out, you did approve $500 million to arm and train the Syrian rebels. On the other hand, you're going to go home without a larger vote to authorize what in effect is a new war. And the question I have is Congress forfeiting its constitutional responsibility?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The president has said this is a war. This is going to last years. That is quintessentially something that it's the power of Congress only to declare. And I think we are really abdicating our responsibility. Congress should take up an authorization use force. As you know, Chris, I've introduced one that would be very narrow, but would, I think, bring this fight within a constitutional framework. I don't accept the administration's argument that we can rely on the 2001 AOMF, which applied to a different conflict against a different enemy at a different time. So I think it's a abdication of constitutional dimension.
I definitely agree with that. I think Congress should be on record when it comes to this kind of war where it's hard to say that it's a response to some imminent threat. There's definitely big buildup and time for Congress to debate. So there's no reason that the president should act without congressional authorization. And then, of course, there's the problem of lack of authorization from the United Nations, because there's the whole question of international law, which I think is kind of a paper tiger. I've talked about that on previous shows, that international law, since there's no enforcement mechanism and there's always ambiguous arguments, and I'm going to show over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Samantha Power was asked that question by George Stephanopoulos, and she sort of played to those ambiguities and claimed, of course, striking Syria is within the UN Charter for self-defense or common defense, or she didn't even use those words, but I'm sure those are the clauses she's thinking of in the answer you can see here.
This week, and the president has said he's prepared to strike Syria. Those strikes could be imminent. Will the United States try to get UN Security Council authorization first, or do you accept now that's just not going to be possible?
Well, let me say that Secretary Kerry just convened a meeting of the Security Council on Friday, which showcased just how much support there is on the Security Council and in the broader international community for the anti-ISIL effort.
But a Russian veto.
Russia has vetoed in the past, but on very different issues. I think Russia has made clear for a long time its opposition to ISIL. The Iraqis have appealed to the international community to come to their defense, not only in Iraq, but also to go after safe havens in foreign countries. And what they mean by that, of course, is Syria, and they're quite explicit about that. So they have made an appeal to the international community for collective defense, and we think we have the legal basis we need if the president decides
without
to
a UN authorization.
Consistent with the UN Charter, it will depend on the facts and circumstances of any particular strike in Syria, but we have the legal basis we need.
So like I said, that's sort of playing on ambiguities on the UN Charter that allows self-defense and collective defense, and who decides whether those arguments are valid or invalid under international law? Nobody really. So that's why I think international law is kind of a paper tiger. And I mean, in terms of congressional authorization, there are actions that Congress can take if they decide, if they have the power to authorize military action, but then if they do nothing, the president can do a lot of things unless they actually make affirmative action, take affirmative action to stop him, like cutting off funding, or eventually I guess they could go to impeachment, but just like failing to vote to authorize military action isn't really enough to stop the president from doing things like striking in Syria. I think that, like I said, I think Congress should go on the record, but in terms of the way the powers play out between the branches, you can't sue to stop the president from striking just because Congress hasn't authorized it. That's just not the way our system works. Congress has to start doing things to stop the president with the power of the purse and possibly impeachment before courts are going to step in. And I mean, that's never really happened with that kind of constitutional crisis. I want to show a couple more quick ISIS clips before I get to the few other topics I'm going to cover. First, one more clip from Samantha Power talking about how there may actually be coalition members who are going to join in and include themselves in the military action. She didn't name who they are, but based on my watching of some of the pundit discussions, it sounds like it might be United Arab Emirates and Jordan, not really Saudi Arabia or Egypt, which were some possibilities I discussed on previous shows. But anyway, Samantha Power was asked this on pretty much all the shows, and she gave the same answer. I'll show the one from Chuck Todd about who are going to be our coalition allies and what forces will they commit militarily over here.
Coalition. You tweeted this on Friday. Huge outpouring of support now at UN Security Council for U.S.-led effort to support fight against ISIL. What countries in this coalition have committed combat troops to fight in Syria? Has any of them done it yet?
Well, let me underscore the point about the outpouring of support. Secretary Kerry convened a meeting of the Security Council on Friday where more than 40 countries spoke in support of the anti-ISIL effort, half at the ministerial level. The French last week joined combat strike missions in Iraq for the first time. You have the Saudis who've come out and offered training bases for the moderate opposition now that Congress has approved the train and equip program that the president put forward. Right. So we're seeing a diverse range of forms of support, and the commitments are coming in every day.
So that's the most we've heard from anyone about how people in the region are going to participate in solving this problem. It's really a regional problem. That's what I've talked about on the show the last couple weeks in terms of my opinion on this, that it's that this ISIS problem should really be solved by some of those countries we've been funding. We've been building up their militaries, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they need to build a coalition, be the moderate Sunnis. I mean, I guess Saudi Arabia is moderate when you compare them to ISIS or the Islamic State, but I want to show one final clip on the whole ISIS, Syria, Iraq situation. This is Bill Maher had on former George W. Bush Secretary of State and also Chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Desert Storm, Colin Powell, and they were discussing this topic of why it is that these regimes where we funded their military aren't policing their own areas for the final ISIS clip of the show tonight here.
Food stamps. I'm talking about Germany, Japan, Egypt, Israel, all these countries that rely on the United States for defense. But what bothers me is always the first response. Why can't they handle it themselves, so much of it? Why are we always the first resort? Why can't we wean them off of this? I know Putin's a bad guy, but Germany has experience fighting the Russians. The other countries, some of them surrounding where ISIS is taking over in the Middle East, they say they hate ISIS. They have air forces. We sold them to them. Why can't everybody else pitch in more?
Well, that's the focus of the president's efforts now, to make sure that as we deal with ISIS, it is not just the U.S. alone. No boots on the ground, as he has said. So let's get everybody involved, and that's why Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel and others are traveling around the world to make sure that others get involved. In the first Gulf War in the 1991 period, when I was chairman, it was Jim Baker, who was our Secretary of State, who went around and raised all the money to support that war, because we were defending the region, not just going to war for the sake of going to war. We kicked the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, we secured the region, and it was the only war America's ever fought where we made a profit.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, we made more money than we spent.
I'm actually not sure that's the best measure of success in a war, whether the United States made a profit, although I think a lot of companies made profits on some of those subsequent wars, Halliburton, for example, or Blackwater, or anyway, you can tell me what you think about that clip from Colin Powell, or all those clips on the whole ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State situation in Syria and Iraq. I think that was about 23 clips on that topic, and I have a few clips on a few other topics I want to show you before I end the program tonight. First, there was this breaking news about someone who broke into the White House, went all the way across the lawn and made it through the White House doors, and it shows sort of a big lapse from the Secret Service, I think, but I'll talk about that a little more after I show. This is the Fox News Sunday report from their reporter Elizabeth, what's her name? Elizabeth Prann, talking about the break-in at the White House over the weekend here.
Security has been enhanced all weekend after a Texas man carrying a 3.5-inch serrated blade jumped over the fence and charged the White House. One Secret Service director said the location of his arrest is unacceptable. It was all caught on video. 42-year-old Oscar Gonzalez sprinting toward the pillars of the north portico. He wasn't stopped until he had passed through the threshold of the White House doors. A source says at least one officer was outside the front door with his weapon out, but decided not to shoot, using his own discretion. Gonzalez was not taken down on the lawn or met by dogs.
I can't understand why the dog wasn't released, why no one intercepted or tackled him, none of the personnel. It's baffling to me, and I think to a lot of folks.
The president was not home at the time, having left just minutes beforehand with his daughters for Camp David. The First Lady was also away. It's only been about a week and a half since a man wearing a Pokemon costume jumped the fence in a similar fashion and charged the White House property. However, he was met immediately by officers with guns and a dog unit. Law enforcement officials conducted a shoulder-to-shoulder sweep of the White House's north lawn, the front plaza, and an adjacent park. Just hours before, New Jersey man Kevin Carr was arrested and charged for trying to enter a barricaded White House entry with his car.
Gonzalez was charged with unlawfully entering a restricted building or grounds while carrying a deadly or dangerous weapon. The Secret Service said just last night they're conducting a comprehensive review. Chris, back to you.
Now, actually, my only real criticism of that report from Elizabeth Prann there is that in the middle of that clip she said that someone dressed in a Pokemon costume had made it onto the White House lawn there, and I looked at the video and he seemed to be wearing a Pokemon hat, but I don't think that was really a Pokemon costume. And one more clip I want to show is from CBS's Face the Nation, where Representative Mike Rogers was on, and Bob Schieffer asked him about this, and he blamed the whole thing on what he called static security and the way that they get kind of apathetic, or their skills atrophy over in this clip.
Rogers, I want to ask you about something that happened here in Washington last night. And this, we keep talking about national security. A guy jumps the White House gate and actually gets into the White House before he's arrested. The president and his family were not there, and all of that. But what needs to be done here?
Well, again, one of the biggest problems in a static security force is atrophy of concern. And I think what you have seen is that they're not doing their audits, their checks, their test runs to make sure that people are up to the right standard. We see this a lot. It happens frequently in other places where there are static security forces. And it's just a matter of the Secret Service upping their game to make sure that they can maintain that every detail matters. A door locked, a quick reaction when somebody hits the fence and over the gate. And I think they're going to have to reinstate some of these ongoing checks about what activities they participate in. And when I'm talking about their self-audits on their security.
So I don't know whether that is accurate or not, or what the problem is with the Secret Service, but it does seem a little disturbing that the door wasn't locked and that someone could make it that far. Of course, President Obama wasn't there, as they reported on that Fox News report that I showed. But anyway, you can let me know what you think about that. Now, I actually want to show a couple quick clips on the issue of student loan debt in the United States. Bill Maher had a guest on, Matthew Segal from this ourtime.org group that looks at issues important to young people. And I thought he had an interesting analysis of why it is that we have the student debt problem we have in the United States now, starting basically back with Ronald Reagan. And I'll show you that clip and talk about it a little more after you see it here.
Are upset about this issue.
Klein represents a system where the federal government is making billions of dollars off of student loan interest rates. They're profiting off of students and paying down the debt.
How much do they profit?
Now, 30 years ago, they profit $180 billion. But $180 billion they profit.
Wow.
Now, 30 years ago, we had a system where there were more grants than loans. Public education was a public good in America, like many other countries. And we realize we're all better off when we live in a country with less stupid people.
Right.
So,
who can't get behind that idea?
At a certain point, we shifted and we said, you know what, you go to college, you're getting rich. So why should the federal government be in the business of getting young people jobs and to make money? That should be a private commodity that you finance with debt. So now we debt finance education. And this whole system is just totally screwed, because what happens is kids get out of college, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt. They can't get a job. The interest on that debt compounds, and then they're underwater for years.
And it affects.
And that's a really good argument, and especially the part about how it's a public good for us to have less stupid people, and that's why we should have more grants than loans, and we shouldn't load up students with debt. And the second clip I want to show is actually not from the HBO broadcast, but from their overtime show. You know, they take internet questions and they do this extra segment at the end, and they've actually started uploading it immediately to YouTube. That's sort of where it is now. Even if you go to the HBO site, it's on a YouTube video. So I'm going to show you a clip of that YouTube video, and you can watch the whole thing on YouTube yourself, the overtime. And this is a clip that has Joan Walsh and Wendell Pierce, who's from The Wire, and also Ray Donovan and the movie Horrible Bosses. Then it's the main part of the clip is Republican Representative Jack Kingston, who tries to respond to the argument that you saw there from Matthew Segal, trying to claim that it's poor people subsidizing rich people, but there are a couple of big flaws in his argument. You can see Joan Walsh tries to point them out, but doesn't really point them out that well, and I'll discuss what they are after I show you that clip here.
You brought up 1980 before. In 1980, I paid $350 a semester at the University of Wisconsin. The school, the UC system here was free until Ronald Reagan decided those uppity kids shouldn't get to go to college for free because they were misusing their education.
Reagan said that the federal government should not be in the business of making young people rich and subsidizing their profits. So
completely turning on its head the entire...
And that's why the GOP is very good at rhetoric, because they loved Ronald Reagan for all of his rhetoric. And he spoke to poor white folk. That's who the GOP folks are, poor white folk, because you might become a member of the rich white guy club.
Are you saying, I want to make sure I understand, you're saying...
So that's the largest portion of poor people here.
My learned, college-educated panelists here, are you saying a truck driver who makes $30,000 a year who did not go to college should subsidize some future doctor and lawyer who did?
Yes.
Because
we have actually,
and you know what? They're subsidizing their own children.
Because we actually decide that the values in our country believe that...
Because it pays itself back many times over.
The blue collar should subsidize the white collar.
We should all.
No, white collar should subsidize the blue collar. And vice versa. Everyone should.
The rich should pay much higher. Truck driver who makes $30,000 a year, should he subsidize the future doctor and lawyer?
So yeah, that argument from Republican Representative Jack Kingston there is kind of stupid. First of all, if you look at the tax code, a trucker making $30,000 a year, if he has at least one child, he's going to actually be eligible for the earned income tax credit. So he'll be getting money from the federal government. He won't be paying taxes. And even if he doesn't have a child, he's like part of Romney's 47% who don't pay federal taxes, and they're the takers or whatever. All of a sudden now a Republican cares about those people. Also, the kids who would be getting the subsidized education are probably the ones who need it the most, are the sons and daughters of the people making $30,000 a year. Not to mention that it will increase the economy, so that this trucker will have more goods to transport, and a better economy means more work for truckers, and maybe he'll need services of this doctor whose education he helps subsidize, and we all benefit from less stupid people, like Matthew Segal said. So that was like a really bad rebuttal from Jack Kingston, I think. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. I have a couple other quick topics I want to cover. First, the NFL player abuser scandal. I'm not a football fan or even much of a sports fan, so that part of it doesn't interest me that much, but the part about child abuse and domestic abuse, especially having worked as a public defender defending indigent people who were charged with both domestic violence and child abuse, I have sort of a due process view on it that some people don't have, although I also think the behavior is really nasty. First, I want to show a quick clip from CBS's Face the Nation. Bob Schieffer pointed out this report from the NFL that kind of snuck by. I hadn't heard. This is like a bigger scandal than some of this other stuff, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
And a shocking report that has gone all but unnoticed. The league says that nearly 1 in 3 NFL players will develop debilitating brain conditions. The anchor of...
Wow, that's pretty nasty. I don't know if that explains some of the behavior problems. I don't think it really does, but that seems like a bigger scandal in terms of the results of the violence in the NFL. But I want to show one other clip, and it's because it talks about the line between child abuse and discipline. They had a former NFL player on CNN's State of the Union. Candy Crowley confronted him with some of his previous abuse charges. His name is Shannon Sharpe. Apparently he's a Hall of Famer. Like I said, I'm not a football fan or a sports fan, so I don't really know how famous he is, but I want to talk about the line between discipline and child abuse after you see that clip here.
Shannon, let me ask you something, because I know over the course of your career there had been civil complaints from women suggesting that you had been violent towards them. Yeah. Tell me where you believe, and there was also another issue after you post football that you were, the case completely dropped, etc. Tell me where you think the line is for the NFL. If you are charged with something, should they say, okay, you're benched till you figure this out? Go ahead.
Candy, let me address those issues. And it's common knowledge. If you Google it or however you go about it, there are 10 complaints against me. 8 of those complaints were child modification. That was where my kids' parents wanted an addition to the money that they were already receiving. So there weren't complaints that I was battering someone. I had a very similar situation to what Adrian Peterson had. My son took something. I asked him not to do it. He did it anyway and took it to a place. I told him not to take it. I asked him what he had in his pocket, and he lied. And so when I checked his pockets, I found what I shouldn't have found, because I asked him to leave it at home. I spanked him. He called his mom. He told his mom I spanked him for no reason. She came over, and she ended up calling the cops, and the cops came out, and Atlanta PD came out. They didn't file a report. She said, he told her that Mr. Sharpe just wants you to leave his property. Well, she wasn't satisfied with the results she got. She ended up going to another entity, and then subsequently I ended up arrested. No charges were dropped.
Right.
But here's the thing, Candy. I get it. There's a very, very fine line between child abuse and discipline. And what's acceptable when I grew up, what you did determined how you got disciplined and what you got disciplined with. Whether it was a hose pipe or bull whip or a belt or a broomstick, extension cord, switches were the least of your problems. But if you did something that my grandparents thought you deserved the harshest punishment, that's what you got. So now, I wouldn't change my background, but I understood that I had kids. There's no possible way I could raise them how I was reared.
Right.
Right? I don't know. Hosepipe, bullwhip, broomstick, that seems like child abuse. But, you know, I'm someone who doesn't believe in corporal punishment, but on the other hand, what I believe in and what should be illegal, I think there's some gap between those two things. Having defended people accused of child abuse who may have just been engaging in discipline, and especially if you look at the laws, especially when I practiced in Missouri for this, and the laws give parents quite a bit of latitude. So there are a lot of things that are legal that I don't think parents should really be able to do. But I don't know. That's the problem with child abuse. But I want to show you one more quick clip. You know, I've been promising that I'm going to do this, this video on the new Jim Crow mass incarceration and the racist criminal justice system. And I am still planning on working on that. I made some progress on that this week. I think the time I'm going to upload it, hopefully I'll get it all done, and then I'll wait for when they announce whether the police officer Darren Wilson's going to be indicted or not, and then I'll release it. But I do have one clip on that. I want to show Wendell Pierce, who I mentioned is an actor who I've really enjoyed on The Wire and on Horrible Bosses, and recently on Ray Donovan, and he was talking about how his experiences really show a racist criminal justice system. And this is the final clip I want to show you tonight from Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO on Friday here.
There was a new video that came out about from Ferguson this week. We were off all of August when most of that hit the fan. But it's a guy who was doing landscaping right near the area, and we don't see the incident itself, but we see the guy who obviously saw the incident on video going, he had his hands up. Right. I think his actual quote was, he had his fucking hands up. And it mirrors every other account we have of this. And it just shows that, you know, this guy, this Michael Brown guy, was just gunned down in the street when he was surrendering. And again, I don't think we need new laws. I don't think we need reparations. I just think white America needs to stop putting forth this toxic idea that racism is over.
And the fact is, The fact is, while we have this very comfortable colloquial debate about it, when the lights go out and I go out in the street and I get behind the wheel of my car, the most dangerous moment I ever have in my life is when a police officer pulls me over. Every black man in America knows that when that happens, there's actually a possibility his life may come to an end, and that shouldn't happen. It actually happened to me in Louisiana, dressed as I am, going to my uncle's funeral, 2 toddlers in the back. I just picked up my cousin from Chicago, 100 degrees on the road in Louisiana. I'm pulled over, and I sat there waiting for the cop to come. I have a habit of always taking my wallet out and putting it on the dash to make sure he doesn't think this is going for a gun. I sat there and sat there and sat there, and I realized he hadn't come. Air condition on, 100 degrees, and I look in the mirror and I see. That's all I heard. As I turned down the window, you hear, "Motherfucker, get out that car, I'm gonna blow your fucking head off." Now, he didn't have the training to say, "I'm gonna come up to the car." I had to tell these toddlers, "Be cool, everything's fine, Uncle Wendell's gonna get out the car, everyone, don't move." I put my hands up, get the car, open the door from the outside. But I told the officer, "Why didn't you use your PA?" Simple, get in your car. "Well, why didn't you respond?" I said, "I had the windows up, it's 100 degrees and the air conditioner is on. I can't hear you." That's poor training, that he didn't know that I wasn't going to be able to hear him in the car. He's going to fire. So it's that sort of incident that happens too often, all the time, that white America has to understand that Wendell Allen in New Orleans, Mr. Garner in Staten Island, Michael Brown in Ohio is a constant all over this country. And if we're going to sit here and pretend that we are post-racial, you have to realize that I can't afford for your belief or denial that my life isn't in danger.
Okay.
But,
well, that's a pretty powerful story. Michael Brown, he said Ohio. It's actually in Missouri, and hopefully I'll be making my video. They talked about some of the new evidence having to do with this bystander who saw Michael Brown with his hands raised getting shot. And I don't know if there's going to be an indictment or not, but I think sometime around the beginning of October, end of September, the grand jury in St. Louis County is supposed to either indict or not indict, and hopefully I'll have my video that, wrong side again, that talks about the racist criminal justice system and the new Jim Crow mass incarceration. Hopefully I'll have that done by the end of September, maybe even this week. We'll see how things go. And anyway, I have to finish up the show. I enjoyed reading the comments of the 100 or so of you who have been watching this live along the way, even though I'm not going to be able to go in there and start a live discussion based on them. But I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out for you and left you a little more informed to begin your week. And I'll be checking the comments to see if anyone has any suggestions on what I should use as my excerpt video that I should be uploading Monday or Tuesday as sort of a short excerpt from the live show for people to watch who don't want to watch a whole hour and 20 minutes, or this is an hour and 15 minutes today, I guess, or around that amount. So anyway, thanks for joining me. I'll be doing this every week, Liberal Viewer Sunday live clip roundup, 6:30 p.m. Pacific, picking out the best clips from the corporate media. And next week, like I said, Michael Che will probably be debuting as the co-anchor of Weekend Update, so that should be interesting. Maybe I'll get some clips from there, and I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.